when you're talking about the Nile and when you're talking about ancient Egypt, how far back do you think that goes?
Oh, I think the Nile goes back a very, very, very long way. The Nile River system 12,500 years ago looked much the same as it does today. Actually, Africa suffered much less from sea level rise than many other continents. The place that was most dramatically affected by sea level rise was around Indonesia and Malaysia. Geologists call it the Sunda Shelf. And again, it shows up on ancient maps as it looked during the Ice Age, not as it looks today. There was a continent-sized landmass that went underwater there. If your continental shelves are very shallow and very, very limited and very deep, then you don't lose a lot of land. But if they're slow and gradual, you lose a great deal of land. Africa didn't suffer so much. The Nile River system was pretty much 12,500 years ago the way that it is today. The big difference was that the Sahara Desert was green and fertile.
And this coincides with Dr. Robert Schoch's assertion that when you look at the Temple of the Sphinx, you're dealing with thousands of years of water erosion.
Yes.
And the last time there was water like that in the Nile Valley was when?
The last time you had the water erosion like that in the Nile Valley was precisely during the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was a period of extremely heavy rains in Africa, and its rainfall, its erosion caused by heavy rains, that is the enigma on the Great Sphinx. We're not saying that there was a flood came over the Great Sphinx. What Robert Schoch is saying, and what his evidence clearly demonstrates, is that we're looking at what's called precipitation-induced weathering that was caused by exposure to about 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And Dr. Robert Schoch puts that 1,000 years precisely in the Younger Dryas period. That's the last time that rains of that magnitude fell on Egypt, and it's why we cannot sensibly accept the insistence of Egyptologists that the Sphinx is just 4,500 years old. By all means, yes, 2,500 BC, the ancient Egyptians were there, but I believe they found the Sphinx already created and already heavily eroded, and that they then recarved its head into the head of a pharaoh. And that head, as Robert Schoch and others have pointed out, is way too small in relation to the body. That makes sense if it was a heavily eroded lion head, which was then later cut down into the head of a pharaoh. The geology speaks to the original Sphinx being more than 12,000 years old. And that's the funny thing, because when Robert Schoch and let's not forget John Anthony West, and I know you had him on his show before he passed. John Anthony West was the first person to suggest that there should be a huge question mark over the Sphinx, that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx suggest it was much older than Egyptologists said, and maybe 12,000 years old. And at that time, the response of Egyptology was, rubbish. The Sphinx can't possibly be 12,000 years old because there's no other megalithic monument anywhere in the world that's anywhere like 12,000 years old. Well, that got blown out of the water completely, forever, by the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which isn't even that far from Egypt. Göbekli Tepe, 11,600 years old, a giant megalithic site. My goodness, if you can make Göbekli Tepe, you can make the Sphinx. It adds hugely to the credibility of Robert Schoch's argument. And I want to pay tribute to Robert Schoch, because there's a mainstream academic who's been willing to stick his neck out. Despite taking all sorts of slings and arrows from his colleagues, he sticks with the data. And what the data says, regardless of what Egyptologists say, is that the Sphinx is 12,000 plus years old.